Megan had always been fascinated by the supernatural. She read ghost stories, watched horror movies, and frequented online forums where enthusiasts shared their paranormal experiences. So when her friend Rachel invited her and two others, Ben and Lisa, to try out a Ouija board in her new apartment on Willow Street, Megan jumped at the chance. The apartment itself was nothing special, but Rachel claimed it had a vibe. She couldn't explain it exactly, but the air always felt thick, and she often heard strange noises at night. Megan was intrigued, though Lisa and Ben were more skeptical. "It's just a game," Lisa said as Rachel laid out the board on the kitchen table. The four of them gathered around, placing their fingers on the planchette. They began with lighthearted questions, asking for names, ages, and silly things like favorite colors. Nothing happened. The planchette sat motionless, and they started to lose interest. But then, as they prepared to stop, the planchette began to move. It spelled out a name, DLIH. Rachel furrowed her brow. "Is that your name?" The planchette slid to yes. "Who are you?" Megan asked, her voice filled with excitement. "Why are you here?" The board responded slowly. MURDRED. A chill ran through the room. Rachel's face drained of color. "Murdered? By who?" "HIM." The lights flickered. Megan glanced around nervously, her excitement fading. "Who's him?" Before they could get an answer, a loud bang echoed from the hallway. Ben jumped up, his chair clattering to the floor. "What the hell was that?" Rachel got up, walking toward the hall, her heart pounding in her chest. She opened the door to the small storage room, where boxes were piled high, untouched since she'd moved in. Everything looked normal, until she noticed a dark stain on the floor beneath one of the boxes. "Megan, come look at this," she called, her voice shaking. Megan approached, her eyes widening at the sight. The stain looked old, darkened with age, but it was unmistakably blood. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Is that—" Before she could finish, the temperature in the room plummeted. Their breath turned to mist, and the Ouija board, still on the table, began to tremble. Suddenly, the planchette moved on its own, spelling out frantically, "Are you in?" Lisa screamed as a cold wind blasted through the apartment, slamming the door shut. The lights flickered again, and in the brief moments of darkness, Megan saw him, a shadowy figure standing at the end of the hall, his eyes glowing faintly in the gloom. The door rattled as the figure moved closer, his form growing more solid with every flicker of the lights. Rachel's heart raced as she grabbed the Ouija board, intending to throw it out. But before she could, the figure lunged, grabbing her by the arm. A sharp, searing pain shot through her as she screamed, her skin burning where he touched her. The others watched in horror, frozen by fear. Megan finally snapped out of it, rushing forward and pulling Rachel away from the shadowy figure, whose face twisted into a grotesque, furious snarl. They ran, down the hall, out the door, and into the street, leaving the board behind. But they couldn't leave the presence. Rachel's arm bore the mark of the spirit, a handprint, charred black into her skin, a permanent reminder of the man who had killed Delia and now haunted her apartment. Even after they moved, the spirit followed. He appeared in reflections, in shadows, always watching, always waiting for the moment when they'd be vulnerable again. In the small town of Fairhaven, legend had it that the old cemetery on the edge of town was cursed. The graves were ancient, some dating back hundreds of years, but one, in particular, was said to be dangerous. The grave belonged to a man named Jameson Crowley, a local criminal who had been executed for his crimes in the late 1800s. His body had been buried hastily, and people whispered that he had never truly been laid to rest. Kevin, Maya, and Josh, three high school seniors with a taste for adventure, decided to test the legend. They sneaked into the cemetery one night with a Ouija board, laughing nervously as they made their way through the overgrown paths to Jameson Crowley's grave. The headstone was cracked and covered in moss, barely readable in the moonlight. "This is it," Maya said, her voice a mix of excitement and trepidation. "Let's see if the stories are true." They sat around the grave, placing the Ouija board on the cold ground. The air was still, the night unnaturally quiet. Kevin placed his fingers on the planchette, and the others followed suit. "Is anyone here?" Maya asked, her voice barely a whisper. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the planchette moved to yes. Kevin chuckled nervously. "Who are we talking to?" The board responded, "Jamiasoen." Josh's smile faded. "Okay, that's creepy." Maya, her curiosity piqued, leaned closer. "Jameson, what do you want?" The planchette moved slowly, deliberately. REVNG. Suddenly, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. The temperature dropped, and the ground beneath them trembled. Kevin tried to pull his hand away, but the planchette seemed to hold him in place, his fingers glued to the board. "I don't like this," Josh muttered, his voice shaking. Before anyone could react, the earth beneath them cracked open, and a skeletal hand shot up from the grave. Maya screamed, jumping to her feet as the hand reached for Kevin, grabbing his ankle with an iron grip. "Help me!" Kevin yelled, struggling to free himself, but the hand was relentless. It pulled him toward the grave, the ground crumbling beneath him as more of the skeletal figure emerged, its hollow eyes fixed on him with a malevolent gaze. Josh and Maya grabbed Kevin, trying to pull him back, but the ground continued to give way, opening wider and wider as the figure of Jameson Crowley dragged itself from the earth. His bones were covered in dirt, his teeth bared in a twisted grin. With one final, desperate pull, Kevin was yanked into the grave, disappearing into the darkness below. The earth closed up as quickly as it had opened, leaving no trace of the hole, no sign that Kevin had ever been there. Maya and Josh ran, their hearts pounding, their breaths ragged. They never returned to the cemetery, and neither did anyone else. Jameson Crowley's grave became a place of legend once again, but now it was more than just a story. It was a warning. Isabella had always loved collecting antique dolls, but none intrigued her more than the porcelain doll she found at a flea market one rainy afternoon. The vendor had been eager to get rid of it, practically giving it away. It had delicate features, with glassy eyes that seemed to follow her wherever she went. She named it Annabelle, after her favorite aunt, and placed it in the center of her collection. One night, curious about the doll's origins, Isabella invited her two best friends, Emily and Sarah, over to help her investigate. They joked about the doll being haunted, though none of them truly believed it. To make the evening more exciting, Isabella pulled out an old Ouija board she'd inherited from her grandmother, a relic from the 1920s. "Let's ask the doll who she is," Emily suggested with a grin. Isabella laughed, setting the board on the floor in front of Annabelle, who sat motionless in her chair, her lifeless eyes gleaming in the candlelight. They placed their fingers on the planchette and began asking questions. At first, the planchette moved slowly, almost lazily, across the board. It spelled out the usual nonsense, greetings, vague answers to personal questions. But when Isabella asked about the doll, everything changed. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The planchette moved quickly now, more forcefully. "Ananabialeli." Emily laughed nervously. "That's funny. It knows the name you gave it." But Isabella wasn't smiling. Her fingers were tingling, a strange, electric sensation running through them. "Why are you here?" The planchette jerked violently across the board, spelling out, "KILL." They all froze. Sarah's face paled. "That's not funny, Isabella." "It's not me," Isabella cried, her voice rising in panic. Before they could react, the candles flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The sound of shuffling feet echoed through the room, followed by the soft, unmistakable sound of porcelain scraping against wood. "Turn on the lights!" Sarah screamed, fumbling for her phone. But as the flashlight flickered to life, they saw the doll, Annabelle, standing on the floor, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her glassy eyes now filled with a dark, malevolent intelligence. The doll moved. It wasn't fast, but it wasn't slow either. It advanced toward them, its tiny hands outstretched, its painted mouth curling into a grotesque smile. The girls scrambled backward, knocking over the board as they tried to escape. But no matter how fast they ran, the doll seemed to follow, its glass eyes never leaving Isabella. The doll's porcelain hand grabbed her ankle, pulling her to the floor. She screamed as the doll climbed onto her chest, its weight much heavier than it should have been. The others tried to pull it off, but it was as if the doll had become fused to her, its grip tightening with every second. Isabella's screams echoed through the house, but no one came to help. When the police arrived the next morning, they found only one thing: Annabelle, sitting perfectly still in her chair, her eyes as lifeless as they had been the day she was bought. But Isabella was gone. The only sign that she had ever been there was a single word, scrawled in blood across the floor of mine. A group of college friends, seeking to break the monotony of a rainy weekend, gathered in an old house that had been abandoned for decades. It was nestled deep in the countryside, surrounded by overgrown trees and vines that clung to the stone walls like grasping fingers. Among them were Alex, Aaron, Mark, and Sophie, who had always been skeptics about the supernatural, except for Sophie, who believed in the unseen forces that lurked in forgotten corners of the world. That night, in the dim candlelight, Aaron pulled out a Ouija board from her backpack, a joke gift she'd received for her birthday. "Let's test it," she said with a playful smirk, knowing it would only stir a few laughs. The others hesitated but agreed. What was the harm? The board was old, its letters faded, but still legible. They placed their fingers on the planchette, all smirking, thinking it would be a fun way to pass the time. At first, the planchette didn't move, as expected, but then, without warning, it slowly began to shift under their fingers. None of them was pushing it. At least, that's what they all claimed afterward. "Who are we speaking with?" Mark asked, laughing, but his voice wavered slightly. The planchette spelled out EVL. They exchanged uneasy glances, assuming one of them was messing around. Alex shook his head, amused. "Very original guys." Sophie, however, wasn't smiling. Her fingers trembled as the board spelled out something else. LOK. "Look where?" Aaron asked, trying to shake off the creeping unease. The planchette slid towards the edge of the board, pointing to the large, dust-covered mirror across the room. It stood tall and ancient, its surface smeared with grime, reflecting the flickering candlelight. Sophie gasped and pulled her hand away from the board. "We shouldn't do this," she whispered, her eyes wide. Ignoring her, Alex stood and crossed the room to the mirror, brushing the dust from its surface. "What are we supposed to see?" The others watched as his face reflected dimly in the glass. But something else moved behind him. At first, it was just a shadow, a slight flicker. Then it became more defined, like a figure standing just beyond the threshold of visibility. "Alex, come back!" Sophie cried, but Alex didn't listen. Instead, he leaned closer to the mirror, trying to discern the figure lurking in the reflection. His breath fogged the glass, and as he wiped it clean, the shadow took form, a woman with hollow eyes and a wide, unnatural grin. Her hand reached toward him, not from behind him, but from within the mirror itself. Suddenly, the woman's hand darted out of the glass, seizing Alex by the throat. He choked, his eyes wide with terror as he tried to pull away, but her grip was inescapable. The others screamed, rushing to help, but as they grabbed him, the mirror began to pulse, its surface rippling like water. With one last, horrifying scream, Alex was pulled into the mirror, disappearing into the glass as if it had swallowed him whole. The others stared at the mirror in horror. Alex was gone, replaced by the woman, who now grinned wider, her eyes locking onto them. Without hesitation, Sophie grabbed the Ouija board and threw it into the fireplace, watching as it burned. But it was too late. The mirror cracked, the fracture spreading like a spider's web, and from each crack, more figures began to emerge, their hands reaching for the next victim. They fled the house, never to return. But every time they looked into a mirror, they feared they might see Alex, trapped in the reflection, reaching for help that would never come.